Welcome to the 34th annual Kitsap County Leadership Prayer Breakfast. 34th, all from the minds and plannings of Mr. Carl here. So that was 1986. Carl, I wasn't here then, I was only 2. But I'm sure it was just an amazing event then as well. Anyway, honored you are all here so early in the morning, on a weekday morning. Well, at this point I was going to read an introduction to Greg, but he touched me on the shoulder and said, oh, the message is what's important, not the messenger. But I do want to say something personal, because when Carl told me last year who the speaker was going to be, I said, awesome. I'm kind of an apologist junkie. I just love taking in the reasons to believe, and I love then disseminating them to my 5th grade students. It's just one of my favorite things to do. So it was about 20-something years ago, 7 or 8. I'm driving around Southern California where we lived, and on KBRT, 740 AM, a little Christian station to listen to, I hear this guy talking on a live call-in show, and it's Greg. I said, I like that. So I tuned in every Saturday morning, wasn't it? I believe. So I have been a supporter of Stand to Reason, str.org, for all those years, my wife and I, because I believe in the truth. Don't you? And I believe when the truth can be articulated and put right here, where we can take it and then walk it. And so, Greg, you've been a big influence in my life. I really appreciate that you dive in and you bring it to us. So would you do that now? Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for that gentle welcome. Reminded of the proverb that says, he who greets his brother with a loud voice early in the morning, that shall be reckoned to him a curse. So I am not a morning person. A woman said, Mr. Koukl, you must have a great time with God in the morning. I said, frankly, ma'am, before my first cup of coffee, I'm an atheist. So I had my coffee this morning, and it tastes wonderful, but it's a little bit low octane, okay, for my taste. So right now, I'm a Jehovah's Witness. I need to say here that yesterday morning, reflecting on the day, I was deeply moved as I thought about our first responders. I'm so happy to see so many, especially in uniform this morning. And the 344 firefighters, the 80 policemen, the 8 EMT and paramedics that charged into that fiery inferno and consequently into eternity on behalf of all those people that they ended up saving. September 11, 2001, 18 years ago yesterday. So, we remember you, and we thank you, first responders, for the role you play in protecting us. I'm here this morning because my life has been deeply changed by an ancient teacher. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. And almost 46 years ago now to the week, when I was a student at UCLA, I began to think more carefully about the claims that Jesus made about himself, about the nature of the world, and the claims that he made in my own life. And I'll tell you, during that period of discussion, actually took a couple of months for me, there was a lot of pushback for me, a lot of challenges, a lot of questions, a lot of leaving the table and come back to the table and having more discussions. But finally, I came to the conclusion that Jesus got it right. That he saw the world the way it really was. And I figured for me, the smart money was on Jesus. And that's when I decided to tuck in behind him and follow him. I've been doing that for 48 years now, or 46 years, something like that. And I got to tell you, it hasn't always been easy. Most of the time it's been kind of hard, actually, but it's been reality. And it's been walking with the author of reality. Now, I want to tell you, though, that I'm not here today to convert you. I mean, that's not my goal this morning. And I know we have a mixed audience here, and I'm glad you're all here. And if you're not a follower of Jesus this morning, my goal is much more modest. I just want to I just want to put a stone in your shoe, okay? I want to annoy you a little bit, but in a good way. I want to get you thinking, because I think Jesus of Nazareth is worth thinking about. And the very specific thing that I want to think about today is I want to focus in on a kind of a broad concept of some ramifications that it has. And here's the broad thing. People like Jesus. Everywhere you go, people like Jesus. Doesn't matter whether they're Christians or not. They have a very, very high view of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but when you get into ethical and public discussions about things that are highly charged, oftentimes you'll hear a statement, well, Jesus never said anything about thus and so, whatever the issue happens to be. And my question that comes to mind is, why should anybody care what Jesus says about that topic or some other topic, that if he was silent on it, apparently, that this somehow is relevant to the topic? And the reason, of course, is because almost everybody cares what Jesus says. Everybody wants to get Jesus on their team, so to speak, you know, representing their group in some way, because Jesus is someone to be reckoned with. Even 2,000 years later, Jesus is still a player. And the ideas that he had about the world, people still take seriously. Again, even if they're not followers of Jesus directly, they don't mark themselves as Christians, they still take to think Jesus is significant. But, and here's the contrasting concept, I don't think most people take him seriously. They like Jesus. They have a picture of him in their mind. They listen to some things that they thought he said, or they understand things that he said, and they're taken with them, and well, they should be. But at the same time, when you read the fine print, in other words, when you look at the things that Jesus actually said about himself, and the reason that he came to earth and did what he did, when it gets right down to the core of what Jesus said he was all about, that's what people don't take him seriously on. And that particular thing is that he came to rescue the world from a terrible problem. And he did it in a way that he is the only one who qualifies as the rescuer. And this is why you'll hear Christians say what turns out to be the most politically incorrect thing you can say nowadays, is that Jesus is the only way of salvation. Let me tell you why they say that. Because Jesus said it. He said it time and time and time again in many different ways. And all of those he personally trained to follow after him said the exact same thing. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you a couple of incidents that happened to me that reflect how the almost universal high regard people have for Jesus, but also at the same time their unwillingness to take him seriously on his main claim. Then I want to clarify what that claim is from the historical record. And then I want to answer the question why he would make such an audacious claim. There's a reason for it, okay? So a few years back, I had three fairly high visibility engagements in public media. There were two television shows and then a national radio show that was on. And the first was a television show in Toronto. And this program was a 1-hour program called Test of Faith. And this is not a religious, well, it's not a Christian program, but it's a secular religious program. And what they would do is they would have a kind of semicircle table, and they would bring in some religious weirdo that would sit in the hot seat on the inside. And then they'd bring out some 2 or 3 or 4 other people that would kind of take him to task there for an hour on national TV. And this was entertainment, they're in the great country of Canada. So they gave me a call and asked me to be part of that enterprise. And by the way, where do you think Mr. Koukl was going to sit? I was the religious weirdo. And what was my weird religious idea? Well, I rejected the notion of religious pluralism. And the way we mean the word in context of that program was the idea that all religions are equally legitimate paths to God. Okay? I rejected that notion. Very popular nowadays and very apparently tolerant. But since I'm a follower of Christ and that wasn't Jesus' view, then that wasn't my view either. So that's my weird idea. And before they do these shows, though, they always have to have an interview. And so I got a call from Toronto, my home in my office in Southern California, and I was interviewed by a young man named Pierre. Pierre was an atheist. He was part of that enterprise. It was great. We're chatting together. He wanted to make sure that I'm weird enough to be on a show. So we talked for about 45 minutes or so, and he figured, yep, you're weird, so we're taking you out. I fly out to Ontario, and then I do the show. And before we started, though, I had a conversation with Pierre, because we just met then. We talked on the phone. And I said, let me give you let's have a gentleman's wager about how this is going to go, because I've been in situations like this before. Here's what's going to happen, I told him. I'm going to give an argument against religious pluralism. And the people on the other side are not going to engage my argument at all. Instead, they're going to start attacking me and start calling me names like intolerant, narrow-minded, and bigoted, and that kind of thing. I said, maybe not, it won't go that way, we'll see. So, first session, cameras start rolling. Valerie Pringle is the host, and I'm by myself. And she asked me why I'm not a religious pluralist. Why do I reject the idea that all religions are equally true paths to God? And I told her that I was going to use a way of arguing that did not trade on my own religious convictions. I mean, I could argue that Jesus said he was the only way, and he gave evidence that he was, and therefore he was, and others therefore are not the way. That's a legitimate way to argue, but I didn't want to take that way because I wanted religious pluralism to be the target and not Christianity. So I said, I'm going to give an argument here that anyone could give, even an atheist, to demonstrate that if some religion might be true, they can't all be true. And so here's the argument. I said, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Well, he either was the Messiah or he was not the Messiah. If he was not the Messiah, the Christians are wrong and the Jews are right on that particular point. If he is the Messiah, well, then the Jews are wrong and the Christians are right, but under no circumstance can they both be right. If God exists, maybe it's an open question, but he's either personal or not. If it turns out that God is not a personal being, well, then the Hindus are right, and the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims are wrong in that point. If God turns out to be personal, then the Christians and the Jews and Muslims are right in that point, and the Hindus are wrong, but they can't both be right. You with me? When you die, maybe you go to heaven or hell, maybe you get reincarnated, maybe you lie in the grave, but you can't do them all at the same time. Somebody's mistaken. In fact, most people are mistaken. Maybe I'm the one that's mistaken. For the sake of discussion, I'm willing to talk about that, and I do talk about it lots with people. But we can't all be right. And the reason we can't all be right is because religions have competing pictures of reality. They make claims about the way the world is that conflict with each other, that contradict each other. They can't all be right. And so then to claim that one religion could be true and others are false is not bigotry. It's just simple math. So there's my argument. Then we went to break. And the first gentleman up was a Sikh. It's a religious order from India. He was actually the gentleman with the turbans. He was actually a well-known TV personality and barrister and attorney from Toronto, and he was the first one up. And so he was asked, what do you think of Mr. Koukl's argument? And he said, well, if Mr. Koukl thinks he won the lottery, good for him. What? Won the lottery? What is he talking about? Well, he went on to explain. He went on our website, str.org, and did some research and found out that we were a Christian organization and believed the standard thing that Jesus taught, that he was the only way of salvation, so good for you. You won the lottery. Well, that was a little bit of a passive-aggressive start, but he didn't say passive for long, because he started getting real mad at me. In fact, he had printed out a bunch of stuff for the website, and he was shaking the stuff across the table at me, and I promise you, Valerie Pringle had to push him down in his seat, because he was so annoyed at me, based on my view. Now remember, this is the kind of tolerant side of the group. This guy's really angry. And he said, you're the kind of person who causes wars, is what he said. And then the next person up was a Hindu pastor. He was a little bit nicer, but he was talking about how all paths lead to the top of the mountain, all roads lead to Rome, that kind of thing. And the next was a liberal Christian pastor from the United Church of Canada, a woman. Now, all of them were pluralists. All of them thought highly of Jesus. But they didn't take Jesus seriously because they denied the thing about Jesus that was central to his mission on earth. It's interesting how the conversation went, though, because before long, as we're talking, certain words start creeping into the conversation. Words like intolerant, and arrogant, and narrow-minded, and bigoted. Now, were they addressing my argument? No, they were fulfilling my prophecy. In fact, I pointed that out at one point. I said, you know, we started out talking about an idea called religious pluralism. Somehow we've gotten off onto a different topic. So now we're on the topic of Mr. Koukl's personality. Mr. Koukl is intolerant. Mr. Koukl is narrow-minded. Mr. Koukl is arrogant. By the way, if I was being arrogant, then shame on me. But that wasn't what was going on there. You know the drill, how this works. Mr. Koukl is all these different things. In other words, what you're saying is Mr. Koukl's mean. All right. My daughters think that. Maybe I am. Why don't I just agree that Mr. Koukl is mean, okay? And this way, since I agree with you now, we all agree that I'm a meanie. Now we got that issue resolved. Can we get back to talking about religious pluralism? I also noted one other thing, because remember, they're very mad at me because I'm a follower of Jesus in the classical sense of the term, not in the kind of postmodern, secularized sense of the word that many people are nowadays, but in the classical sense of the term. And so I said to them, it's clear that you think my view is wrong. My form of Christianity is not right. It's false. And if it's false, it's not a legitimate path to God. Think about it so you see where I'm going. So in other words, if you are right in what you're claiming against me right now, you're wrong in what we're supposed to be talking about here today. That all religions are equally legitimate. Yes. They didn't get it. One whole hour, they didn't get it. I'll tell you who got it. Pierre got it. The atheist got it. And frankly, at the end of the show, he was hopping mad. He bounced up onto the stage, was talking to me, and he was really mad at the scene. And he's using the language appropriate for an atheist to express himself too. Well, I was actually on 2 shows that day. That was the first one that demonstrates this point that people like Jesus, but they don't really take him seriously. Another show, I was actually in the hotel, and I got a call early from my show time from the studio. And they said, can you come in earlier and do another show because we have some other weirdo sitting in the hot seat. We need someone on the outside because we had a Christian pastor scheduled, and he's inebriated. Not a Baptist, I imagine. Although they do say if you go fishing, you got a Baptist with you to keep him from drinking all the beer in your boat. You got to bring it on the Baptist. So would you fill in for him? And I said, well, yeah, all right, whatever. And I came in and did this other show. And in this particular case, the person, the weirdo in the hot seat was an Episcopal bishop. Okay, think about this. High-ranking man of the cloth in the Episcopal Church. What was his weird religious idea? He rejected the deity of Christ. He rejected the resurrection of Christ. He talked about the Jesus that we believe in is the Christ of faith and not the actual Christ of history. Now, all of these are kind of odd things because central to Jesus' enterprise was who he was, the creator of everything else. This is right at the beginning of the Gospel of John. All things are made through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. But also, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, regarding the resurrection, he said, look, if Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, if we are preaching that he rose from the dead and he didn't rise from the dead, not only are we liars, but you're still in your sin. You are putting your faith in someone to forgive you, and he never did what was necessary for you to be forgiven. You know what that means? People should feel sorry for us. That's what Paul said. We are of most people to be pitied. Now I wonder if the good bishop had ever read 1 Corinthians 15 and saw the logic that Paul laid out there. And so we had our discussion here. Here's an Episcopal bishop, a man of the cloth, who thought Jesus was great, but did not take Jesus seriously. And so as I flew back from Toronto after having done those two shows, I'm driving away from LAX, and I get a call from my staff. And apparently our office had just gotten a call from Alan Combs' organization. Now, Alan Combs, you might recognize as, he used to be the other half of Hannity and Combs on Fox. So Hannity is a very conservative commentator. Alan Combs is very left of center as a commentator. And this was the fair and balanced kind of show where they each give their own side. I think Alan Combs still works for Fox. I see him on there on occasion. But in any event, so I was being asked to be on his radio show, his national radio show. And Alan apparently had written a book about liberalism. He's actually, I think, a leftist, not a liberal, but in any event, his book was on liberalism. And he had a chapter there about Jesus. And his claim was that Jesus was a liberal. Now notice, by the way, Alan Combs, the political leftist, is trying to get Jesus on his team, right? Why is he trying to do that? Because he thinks Jesus is a player, he's someone to be reckoned with. It's just the same syndrome here that I was talking about earlier. But he's arguing that Jesus was a liberal. And so he wanted somebody on his program to argue that Jesus wasn't a liberal and to go at it together. So now I wasn't so concerned with the political aspects of that discussion, but he's got a very big footprint, right? And it's, for me, that's a very target-rich audience, all right? So I'm going to go on to the show. I did that later that afternoon. And it was interesting the way Alan Combs argued that Jesus was a liberal. And here's what he said, and I'm not making this up, and I'm not trying to poke fun. I'm just telling you what happened. Jesus was a liberal, Alan Combs said, because he came to liberate the captives. And that's a citation from the text somewhere. And because he came to liberate the captives, he was a liberal. Because liberals liberate. That's what he said. And then he said, also Jesus upset he cleansed the temple, therefore he was against capitalism, and which that wasn't the point of cleansing the temple at all in any event. And since he was concerned with defending the poor against the rich, which also wasn't Jesus' concern, he was therefore a liberal. Now, in light of those citations, I asked Alan Combs, I said, how much have you actually studied Jesus? He said, well, you know, I've looked at a fair share kind of thing. And of course, I knew that meant he hadn't looked at all, except for a couple of verses that he thought supported his view. And I did point this out. I said, Alan, one of the liabilities of going to the Bible and making a case about this, and this is true for liberals or conservatives, you start quoting Jesus, the habit is to try to cherry-pick passages that seem to support your view without understanding the big picture. And if you don't understand the big picture, like with anybody else, you can't be confident you're taking his views accurately. I said that's one liability. Here's a second liability. You start quoting Jesus to people out of your book, people might end up going back to the original sources and read them themselves, which to me would be a great thing. And in fact, I said this on the air. I said, don't go to Alan Combs' website. Don't go to Greg Koukl's website, str.org. Go right back to the historical sources themselves, and you let Jesus speak for himself. And of course, my point was, when you let Jesus speak for himself, and you go back to the sources, you realize that none of the points that he was being made could be justified as first of all, the political views of Jesus, or the reason that Jesus came. Because Jesus did not come to establish peace and help us all get along and to restore social justice. I'm just going to throw this in to set some of you on your ear a little bit, okay? Because this is a very, very popular notion right now among progressive Christians, that what Jesus was all about was social justice. What if I told you you could take every single thing that Jesus ever said about helping the poor and restoring social justice, I should say so-called social justice, and you could remove it from the Gospels and you would not influence Jesus' mission one single bit? Some of you are thinking, bite your tongue. But that is exactly what one of Jesus' closest associates did. John, the beloved disciple at the end of the first century, penned the most elegant characterization of the person and work of Christ. And in that entire account of the life of Jesus, he never mentions a single word about helping the poor or restoring social justice. Does this mean Jesus didn't care about that? No, it didn't mean he didn't care about it. It means that isn't the reason he came. That's why an entire account could exclude everything that has anything to do with that and not undermine the goal and the purpose of Jesus at all. And that's what I want to talk about just now for a moment. And I realize, look, this message that I'm discussing now, it is hard to find a more offensive thing that any Christian could ever say to anyone about religious matters, that Jesus is the only way of salvation. Listen, I get it. Before I became a Christian, I felt exactly the same way. That is narrow-minded, that is arrogant, that is bigoted, whatever. Now, of course, I hope from what I said with regards to the argument I offered on that TV program, you see, it may not be bigotry at all. It certainly doesn't have to be bigotry. Claiming that that all religions can't lead to God, they can't be equally true, is just a matter of simple math. It's not bigotry. It could be that they're all wrong, for goodness sake, but it cannot be that they're all correct. So I understand this is an offensive thing. And by the way, it is identified in the text as offensive, and it's the thing that got Jesus killed, by the way. When you look at the historical record, you find a couple of things that really stand out if you're reading it. You don't have to read that carefully. You don't have to be a scholar, you don't have to be an apologist or a theologian or a philosopher or anything like that. Just read it. Let Jesus speak for himself. And I'll tell you what stands out, is that what mattered to Jesus was not his teachings. It was him. He was the center of the whole enterprise. It was all about him. Other religious teachers drew attention to themselves, to their teachings. Jesus drew attention to himself. Other teachers died and their followers deified them. Jesus claimed to be God, and his followers left him when he was crucified. He's very unique in that regard. When you think about the kinds of things that he claimed, I am the resurrection and the life. Anybody who believes in me will live even if he dies. I am the bread of life. He who drinks from me will never thirst. I'm sorry, that's the... I gotta have a lot of religious brethren here that tell me. I am the living water. He who drinks of me shall never die. I am the bread of life. He who eats of me will never die. It's a minor mix of metaphors. You get my point. Kind of really messed up that dramatic moment, didn't it? Let me just say it this way. Jesus said it a whole lot better than I did. And a whole lot of other things. I'm the Alpha and the Omega. I'm the beginning of the end and the end. Look at these incredible things that Jesus himself said. He drew all the attention to himself towards the end of his ministry. He said, "Who do people say that I am?" Apostles gave some responses. And he asked the most important question anyone could ever ask. Who do you say that I am? And Peter, speaking for the group, said, "You are the Christ, the Messiah." The Messiah, by the way, not a Messiah, not one of the Messiahs, not one way of many ways. You are the Messiah, the Son of God. And in fact, early Christians they didn't call themselves Christians. This was a name that was given to them in Antioch. It was kind of like a name that was making fun of them a little bit. They called themselves the Way. Why did they call themselves the Way? Because they followed the one who identified himself as the Way, the Truth, and the life. That is what the historical record demonstrates. And when you go to the trial of Jesus, he was not executed for anything he did. They could not find any harm in this man. He did nothing wrong. And so the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" Both of those together. The Messiah, God come down, Emmanuel, God with us. Are you that guy? And Jesus said, "You have said it yourself." And then added insult to injury by saying, "You will not see me again until you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory." And here he's citing from the book of Daniel, this divine creature coming through the skies. And he's saying, I'm that guy. The priest tore his clothes. And he said, "We don't need any more evidence. This man has blasphemed. Crucify him." So Jesus was not crucified for what he did. He wasn't a political rabble-rouser, an infidel in that regard. He was crucified for who he claimed to be. That's what the record shows. And by the way, just to be clear, Jesus was not a pluralist. Here's what he said. Sermon on the Mount. Remember this one? This is famous, right? Sermon on the Mount is the best known sermon anyone's ever delivered. Enter by the narrow gate. If the gate is wide and the way is broad, that leads to destruction, and many are those who enter by it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it. And so we shouldn't be surprised when Jesus gives that message there many, many times. In fact, I've got a little red booklet right here. You can find it on a table out there. 100 verses where Jesus or his followers made that claim implicitly or explicitly that he was the only way of salvation. Here's the way Peter put it. Soon after Jesus, about a month or so after Jesus' resurrection, Jesus was already ascended, speaking to Jewish leaders, who, by the way, already had a religion. These are people who already had a religion. And here's what he said: "There is salvation in none other. For there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." That's pretty clear. And on and on and on. I don't have time to read 100 verses. It is absolutely thick through the record that this was Jesus' self-concept. And it's clear that this is the way his followers understood it, because as they went out having been trained by him, they all said the same thing. Now, I have a question. Was Jesus right? There's a fair question to ask, and maybe some of you are asking it right now in your minds. Was Jesus right about that? The record is clear about what the claim is. Let me make an observation, by the way. If you think highly of Jesus, as I said, most people do, they must have some source of information about Jesus that they're basing their high view of Jesus upon. All right? Now, there are 17 non-biblical sources that talk about Jesus and give us a pretty good outline about who he was. Extra biblical historical sources, etc. But really, if you want to have an opinion about Jesus, you got to go back to the original sources that we know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So everybody who has a high opinion of Jesus is drawing that opinion from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so all I'm saying is let's go back to the same sources everybody is already drawing on to have their high view of Jesus and take a closer look at what he actually said. And these are the claims that he made. So we would ask the question. Now, there are really only three options here, and they're fairly simple. One, that he was right. The other one is he's wrong. But that can be divided into two categories. If Jesus was wrong, maybe he knew he was wrong. Or maybe he didn't know he was wrong. So either was Jesus knew he was wrong, or he was wrong and didn't know he was wrong, or he wasn't wrong. I mean, that's pretty much it. Covers all the bases. So I just want you to think about that a little bit based on what you know about Jesus from the historical record. if Jesus made all of these radical claims, and he was wrong and knew it, that means he was lying. He was lying about the most important thing. All of these extravagant claims that he made, now he wasn't telling the truth. Which just strikes me as a little bit odd, because most people consider Jesus a great moral teacher, a great man, a great prophet. And his whole life was based on a lie. And by the way, it's worse than that, because this lie was calling people to have fidelity to him to the point of death. In Matthew 10, he says, don't fear them who can kill the body and not the soul. Fear rather him who can throw body and soul in hell. He's predicting that Christians are going to be persecuted and executed, and he's saying that's okay because you've chosen the greater good. And this guy's lying? It's even worse than that, because if he's lying, that means he knew all of his claims were false, yet he was willing to go to the most brutal execution imaginable at the time on the basis of a lie he knew was a lie. I mean, can you imagine him, the liar, now on the cross? What was I thinking? Now, that doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense to me. Okay, well, maybe he was wrong, but he didn't know he was wrong. That would be a liar. That's not likely. Let's say he was wrong, but he thought he was right. So he thought he was the resurrection and the life, and he who believes in him would never die. He thought he was the living water, and if you drink of it, you will live forever. Get that right? He thought he was the bread of life, and if you eat of that, you will live forever. He thought he was the Alpha and the Omega. He thought he was the creator of the entire universe. Emmanuel, God with us. But he wasn't. That's possible. So what do we make of a person who thinks those things are true about him, but are not? That person is certifiable. I don't think you say crazy anymore. Is that crazy? That's like politically incorrect. He's a candidate for a special kind of hospital. Maybe that's the word we use. It's like criminals now are people that have had an experience with the legal system. This is what it is. They had to stay over with these nice people for a couple of months, right? Language is weird nowadays. No, this guy's certifiable. He's nuts. Now, does that alternative make sense based on what you know about Jesus? I mean, people read the Sermon on the Mount sometimes to calm their nerves. I lay in bed at night. I wake up in the night. I worry about stuff. You know what I do? I very slowly and thoughtfully recite the Lord's Prayer. That's in Matthew chapter 5 or 6. It's the part of the Sermon on the Mount, and that calms me down. It helps me get back to bed. Right? This is the man who they sent soldiers to go arrest, and the soldiers came back empty-handed. And they said, why didn't you arrest Jesus? And he said, no man speaks as this man speaks. This is a crazy man. Listen, if Jesus is crazy, what does that say for you and I? Right? No, I don't think that's a good alternative. It doesn't seem to make sense that Jesus was wrong and knew it, he was lying. It doesn't seem to make sense that Jesus was wrong and didn't know it, he was crazy. That leaves Jesus was wrong. That's the only other alternative. Now, this is a very ancient argument. In the Latin, cur deus, cur homo malus. That was the ancient formation. In other words, either God or a bad man. Either God or a bad man. There is no middle ground. A lot of people want to say, well, he wasn't God. He didn't rise from the dead. That's the Episcopal priest's point of view that was on the TV show. No, he didn't do that. But he's a nice guy. We like him. Here's what C.S. Lewis said regarding that particular way of thinking. He said, either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, You can spit at him and kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now this leads us, I think, to an unavoidable conclusion. If my way of thinking has been reasonable and sound up to this point about assessing Jesus' life and his claims about himself, then Jesus was who he claimed to be. All of those things that he said about himself were true and sealed with the issue that I'm not even going to have time to get into, by the resurrection, for which we have abundant historical evidence. In fact, Paul in Romans opens up the book there by saying he was declared with power to be the Son of God through the resurrection. So there's a whole other line of evidence that we have to support that Jesus got it right. But you see, if Jesus got it right, that means the other folks got it wrong. It's just a simple matter of elimination. And Jesus had unimpeachable credibility. But why? Why is Jesus the only way of salvation? Why did he make such a radical claim? Well, there's a reason. And it's a good reason. And I'm sad to say it's a reason that a whole lot of followers of Jesus have not kind of figured out in a clear fashion. In other words, the change hasn't fallen into the meter, even for many Christians, in a clear and a crisp way. So let me explain why Jesus is the only way of salvation. I can say it in one sentence, a general sentence, and then I'll give you some details. Here's the general sentence. The reason that Jesus is the only way of salvation is because he's the only one who solved the problem. The reason he's the only way of salvation is because he's the only one who solved the problem. The problem, broadly put, is the problem of evil. But not just the problem of evil in the world, the problem of evil in each one of our hearts, because we are the ones who are continuing to author the problem of evil in the world. It isn't out there, it's in here, and we each know that. Jesus came to solve the problem of evil. And singular problems sometimes have singular solutions. And Jesus solved the problem in a very particular way. He made a trade. His life for ours. And that trade happened on a large outcropping of rock on the outside of Jerusalem. The locals called it Golgotha, the place of the skull. We know it as Calvary, the place of the cross. Crucifixion is a cruel form of punishment. It's generally reserved for slaves and rebels. And the way people die, you may not know this, in a crucifixion is usually by suffocation. Because being pinned, as they are, to the cross beams of the cross, with legs and hands, feet and hands, they can only breathe by extending themselves up. And so they have to push against the nails in the feet, pull against the nails in the hand to get up to be able to exhale and get another breath, and then they collapse down. And they have to kind of keep doing this with their body. Remember, many of them, especially Jesus, had his back shredded by whips. Now rubbing against that coarse wood, eventually they lose their energy and their strength, and they just collapse, and then they suffocate to death. But for Jesus, the pain of the cross was paled in the face of a greater anguish, a deeper torment that could not be seen. More excruciating than those nails or the whip or the crown of thorns or the beatings that he experienced, more dreadful than all of that. Rather, it was a dark and terrible and incalculable agony and infinite misery, actually, as God the Father unleashed his fury upon his sinless Son, as if Jesus was guilty of an immeasurable evil. Now, why punish the innocent one? On the top of Jesus' cross was a thing called a titulus. It listed his crime against the nation, King of the Jews, so sedition, ostensibly. But Paul in Colossians chapter 2 says that there's another certificate of debt, as it were. Crimes, a list of crimes that were pinned to Jesus' cross. And by the way, in the ancient Near East, when those certificates of debt were paid, characteristically in their economy, they would write a single word across the face of it. That word was tetelestai. It's a Greek word. It means cancel. Okay, like canceling your check. Paid. You know, boom, like that. But Paul says that there was another certificate, a list of decrees that were against us. If you look forward in the book of Revelation, chapter 20, the books are open there. I call them the books of death. They're opposed to the book of life. And in those books are written every single deed that you or I or everyone has ever done against God. Every single deed. He's making a list and he's checking it twice. That is his grounds of judgment at the end. Our lives are laid open and bare for everyone to see. Paul says that Jesus took that, our rap sheet, and he nailed it to Jesus' cross. So that in the darkness that shrouds Calvary from the 6th to the 9th hour, a divine transaction, a trade is taking place. Jesus is making a trade with the Father. And the crimes of all humanity, Jesus takes upon himself as if he was guilty of all. And in the end, I mean, arguably, the cross doesn't take his life. He doesn't die of asphyxiation or stress or anything like that. But rather, when the last of the crime has been paid for, Jesus just dismisses his spirit to the Father. He just lets his life go. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. But before he does, a single word escapes his lips. Tetelestai. Now your Bibles translate it is finished, but Jesus isn't saying, man, I'm glad that's over with. This is a victory cry. This is his stamp on the certificate of debt of our sins, paid in full. Why is Jesus the only way? He's the only one who paid in full. And if we do not avail ourselves of that magnificent gift, if we do not put our trust in him to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves, and that is rescue ourselves from the great list of crimes that we have against God. If we do not trust him for that, then we pay that price ourselves. Either Jesus pays or we pay. And no other religious leader can do this because they have their own list of crimes that need to be paid for, need to be forgiven, some more than others. But a list, nonetheless, thus a ponderous list, the chains they forged in life, link by link. We put that on ourselves. Jesus wants to take it on. Come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Jesus, the only way of salvation. Jesus, the only rescuer. Jesus came for a reason. Not to help the poor, not to be a good teacher of morality, not to show you how to improve your life, not as one way of many ways. He came to rescue sinners from their crimes against God. And he did that on a cross where he took those crimes on himself. And when we put our trust in Jesus, that which was ours, our sin and guilt and liability for punishment, becomes his, and that which is his, righteousness that he earned through his perfect life, becomes ours. That is the trade, and it's good news. But it's only good news if you take Jesus seriously. For me, that happened September 28, 1973. And when I decided that night to follow Jesus, I did not decide to follow Jesus because I thought he was going to make my life wonderful. He was going to get my old girlfriend back for me. He was going to give me a fancy profession. He was going to make my life sweet and wonderful and solve all my problems. It's easy flying from here out. That is not what... Some people were saying that, but that isn't why I became a Christian. I became a Christian because I was convinced it was true. And that was the only question that mattered. Some of you feel like, well, I don't have a need. I don't need Jesus. I'm doing fine by myself. You have a need. And the need is chronicled in that book of death that lists every idle word that you have ever spoken. That's what Jesus said. He will give account of in the day of judgment. Nothing has been missed. And one day you will stand before the judge, which we read earlier, is to be Jesus himself.
Amen.
Having qualified for that by having risen from the dead, and we'll stand before him. Yes. The question is, when we stand before him, will he be our Savior, or will he be our judge? That night, September 28, 1973, I bowed my head in my apartment there, and I said a simple prayer. It's a prayer anybody here can say right this moment. And you know, this is a prayer that we haven't offered. You can say, even if you've been a Christian for a while and been really messing up, you've been walking in the wrong direction, and maybe this is yours too. And for some of you, maybe this is just the first time that you've ever really come to grips with yourself before a holy God and bent your knee. And you could say something like what I said. You could say it right now in your heart. Lord Jesus, I need you. I need you because I have been running from you for a long time, and I have been offending you for a long time, and I am guilty before you. Thank you for taking the weight of my sin on yourself and making it possible for me to be completely and fully forgiven. That my crimes against you, past, present, and future, paid in full. I give you my life. Walk with me